Oh, hello. Welcome back to Glitterature Alley. I am Tootight Lautrec, the drag laureate of Glitterature Alley, and here we are, once again, at the bottom of the down staircase in the permanently sequestered remainder section of an unnamed local library, which may or may not have two literary lions growling on the front steps because they are as angry as I am that we have never heard of this week's entry into our series Pulitzer Who, where I discuss Pulitzer Prize winning fiction, which I have heretofore never been made aware. This week's entry is, spoiler alert, wonderful. I really love it. So after we discussed last week, after Margaret Wilson's The Abel McLaughlins, which won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel in 1924, we passed by Edna Ferber, who won in 1925 for her novel So Big. And then in 1926, Aerosmith won. And no, not the Aerosmith of Dude Looks Like a Lady, as apt as that may be for certain people who may be skulking around in Glitterature Alley. No, dream on. This Aerosmith that I'm discussing is the novel written by Sinclair Lewis, which won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel in 1926. And I'll just note here that of the first 8 winners of the Pulitzer Prize for the novel, 4 of the winners had been women and 4 of the winners had been men, which I find rather remarkable considering that women didn't even have the right to vote until 1920. But I'll just park that there. So up until now, we have a tie between the men and the women, and breaking that tie in favor of the men comes Louis Bromfield for his novel Early Autumn in 1927. Louis Bromfield, born December 27th, 1896, and he lived until March 18th, 1956. Louis Bromfield was born in Mansfield, Ohio, to a rather unsuccessful banker and real estate developer. And then in his teens, he and his family moved to his maternal grandfather's farm on the outskirts of town, which also later then failed. But it started his interest in sustainable organic agriculture, which became his actual career after his literary career waned, we shall say. And it waned because, according to that source of all knowledge, Wikipedia, critics such as Malcolm Cowley and Orville Prescott and Edmund Wilson said that, and I'm quoting Wikipedia, they dismissed his later fiction as contrived and superficial. But my goodness, I can't really say that his career waned because when I look at his record, he seems to have published almost a book a year up until the end of his life. So I think he did okay, but maybe he wasn't as successful later in life. But Early Autumn, which was published in 1926, as I said earlier, is really magnificent. As an aside, he also spent a year in Hollywood where he apparently added to the script of Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. So he had quite a career. And if we look at the books that were published in 1926, which vied for the prize alongside Bromfield, we have Sinclair Lewis, who published the book Man Trap, Willa Cather for her book My Mortal Enemy, Edna Ferber again for Showboat, William Faulkner's first novel, Soldier's Pay, excuse me, and some guy named Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway, is that how you say it? Yes, Ernest Hemingway, who wrote a book called, what was that book called? Oh yes, The Sun Also Rises. Maybe you've heard of it. And to be fair, I think that perhaps because The Sun Also Rises was not set in the United States, it was set in Spain, that may be why it was exempted from the Pulitzer, because the Pulitzer was a very American-centric prize. So that may have been what happened there. Also that year, Sherwood Anderson published a book that was called Tar, A Midwestern Childhood, which may have been like a semi-autobiography autobiographical memoir, but it was in the guise of fiction. But Early Autumn by Louis Bromfield won. Early Autumn is a book about a staunch, S-T-A-U-N-C-H, staunch New England Boston Brahmin family, aptly called the Pentlands, with whom propriety and reputation triumphs over those messy human desires and emotions. Yuck, we hate those. But I said it before, it's wonderful. And I mean it's wonderful along the lines of Edith Wharton and Jane Austen. Wharton because of the depth of emotion that it plumbs, and Austen because it is so witty and bitchy in the best ways, and both Austen and Wharton because the language is so really excellent. It's funny, smart, disturbing, and compelling, plus the language is superb without being obtrusive or overbearing. And it begins like this. One moment, please. There was a ball in the old Pentland house because for the first time in nearly 40 years there was a young girl in the family to be introduced to the polite world of Boston and to the elect who had been asked to come on from New York and Philadelphia. Okay, I'm only going to read the first sentence because, as I think it was Gloria Naylor who said this, the DNA of any story or book is in the very first sentence, and that seems to be the case here. If we just look at that first sentence, there was a ball. So we start right out with some sort of party of sorts. At the old Pentland house. So it's old. Note the old. And the name Pentland. And think of pent as in pent up aching rivers. And you have an idea of what this house may be like. Because for the first time in 40 years, 40 years is a very long time, and this is the first time since 40 years ago that they have had, there was a young girl. So into this dusty old house, youth is suddenly blooming again after a very, very long time. There was a young girl to be introduced to the polite world of Boston and to the elect who had been asked to come from New York and Philadelphia. The polite world, note. The elect, it's by invitation only, and they are coming from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, which screams history, tradition, propriety, wealth. Oh my. So, here we get our first introduction to the Pentland family, an old school, uptight, polite Boston Brahmin family, hewing tightly to the old ways of introducing a young woman into society. Now, the subtitle of this book is A Story of a Lady, and that lady is the mother of the young woman who is being introduced to society. In fact, this book is about 4 strong women who are strong in very different and often opposing ways. The young girl of the first sentence is Sybil Pentland, who is 18 years old, and she's the daughter of the lady around whom this book revolves. Olivia Pentland is 39 years old, Sybil's mother, and she is described like this. And I will be reading a lot from this book because I just find the language to be really excellent. If she, and she is Sybil, if Sybil had a rival in all the crowd that filled the echoing old house, it was Olivia Pentland, Sybil's mother, who moved about alone most of the time, watching her guests, acutely conscious that the ball was not all it should have been. Now, if we were to replace her life with the ball, it would tell the story of this book. Her life was not all it should have been. She's married to a man named Anson Pentland, who even at the time when she married him, she's thinking back upon the time when she first met him, and she describes him thus when he was courting her. and she thinks about him. And she saw Anson now, across all the expanse of years, not as a Prince Charming come to rescue her from an ogre aunt, but as he had really been, a rather anemic man, past 30, of an appalling propriety. There was a bitter humor in the memories of his timid advances toward her, of all the distaste with which he approached the details of marriage. And I just find that such a witty way of saying that she's a bit dry in the bedroom department. So that was Anson when he was young. And then she goes on to describe him a little bit later as a man of 49 who looked older, with a long, hoarse face that was handsome in a tired, yellow sort of way. A man who would always do not perhaps the proper thing, but the thing accepted by his world as proper. So after an argument after the ball, after their daughter's introduction to society, Olivia and Anson have a little bit of an argument, and she leaves, and this is her leaving the room. Closing the door quickly, she left him there, startled and exasperated among all the Pentland souvenirs, and slowly, in a kind of nightmare, she made her way toward the stairs, past the long procession of Pentland ancestors, the shopkeeping immigrant, the witch burner, the professional evangelist, the owner of clipper ships, and up the darkened stairway to the room where her husband had not followed her in more than 15 years. So we get a pretty clear description of their marriage right there. Bromfield's descriptions, his ability to distill character, situation, setting, and mood in these swift, witty strokes is, I believe, as impressive as Jane Austen's ability to do the same. And his ability to delve deeply into his character's dreadful inner yearnings with clarity and passion, I think rivals Edith Wharton. So there are two other formidable women in this book. Aunt Cassie, who's an old busybody, and Anson's cousin Sabine Carpenter, who returns to Durham, which is the name of the Pentland estate, after an absence of 20 years in Europe and a divorce. And Aunt Cassie is described at one point as resembling a dignified but slightly uneasy crow perched on a fence. And Sabine Carpenter is described thusly: once she had been one of them, and now seemed completely independent of them all. A traitoress who had flung to the winds all the little rules of life drilled into her by Aunt Cassie. And at one point in the novel, Cassie and Sabine are going back and forth at one another, and another character notes that they are very much alike, and their threats, which are some of the bitchiest and the wittiest parts of the novel, that character notes that Sabine is Cassie turned inside out. So here we've got the setting, and we've got the major players, and throw in a madwoman in the attic for good measure. And if you're looking for a good recipe for fiction, here you go. Enter a stranger. And if that stranger happens to possess all the characteristics opposite to the setting and the majority of the major players, then you've got a story. So now, meet Michael O'Hara, who has risen from humble beginnings to become wealthy enough to buy the farm across the river from Durham, which is the Pentlands estate. And so Cassie and Sabine are going back and forth, and Sabine sees Michael O'Hara coming, and Cassie wants to leave because she doesn't want to have anything to do with this shanty Irishman. The Boston Brahmin people don't even look at them. They don't speak to them. She doesn't want anything to do with them. But Sabine calls him in anyway and sort of tricks Cassie into meeting him. The door opened, and O'Hara stepped in. A swarthy, rather solidly built man of perhaps 35, with a shapely head on which the vigorous black hair was cropped close, and with blue eyes that betrayed his Irish origin by the half-hidden sparkle of amusement at this move of Sabine's. He had a strong jaw and full, rather sensual lips, and a curious sense of great physical strength, as if all his clothes were with difficulty modeled to the muscles that lay underneath. He wore no hat, and his skin was a dark tan, touched at the cheekbones by the dull flush of health and good blood. Okay, so there we have Michael O'Hara. And here we have Early Autumn, which is a story of a woman ensconced in a staid, proper, polite world into which steps a shanty Irish man, made rich farmer and ambitious politician to boot, scorned by all the best Boston Brahmin families, who's ruffling with his terrific vibrancy the dusty, undisturbed tomb of the Pentland estate. It's wrenching, beautiful, funny, and sad, and I will say no more about it than that. Read it for yourselves. Now, I always ask, or I always talk about, if there were any qualms. Do I have any qualms about this book? No, I do not. I have no qualms about Early Autumn. It's magnificent. What kept me reading, or what stopped me reading? Bromfield's descriptions of everything kept me reading, whether it's architecture or land or moods or personalities or people or situations. It's all done so well that it gave me the experience that I always yearn for when I'm reading fiction, which is that I disappeared. The only thing existing when I was reading this book was the world of the book. So every once in a while, I may have stopped to reread a sentence or two simply because I enjoyed rereading that sentence, because I found it so witty. It's really, I can't praise this enough. Do I recommend it? I do indeed. Early Autumn by Louis Bromfield, winner of the 1927 Pulitzer Prize for the novel, should not be forgotten. It is wonderful. And we all know how I feel about wonder. Pay attention. I am Tootight Lautrec. Until we meet again. Mwah.